All right. Start my timer. So this is some work Shirley and I have been doing for a couple of years. And coincidentally, the sample sites and locations are actually they're within the grid of Martial's talk and the work that he's been doing with Christoph, and the timing is also within that time block. So we're kind of working in the same spot. So Bob talked about this a little bit earlier, but why do we need to care about abiotic silicon biogeochemistry in deltaic sediments? They're a sink for elements, and they're also a source of CO2, important in ocean acidification. So this process that I'm going to be talking about is known as reverse weathering. It is, in general, when you take some sort of a silicon source, you can think about that perhaps dissolved diatom silica, you add some aluminum, some cations, some bicarbonate, and you generate aluminosilicate. So you generate new clay, but you also produce CO2. So the products are the reverse of chemical weathering, even though this isn't a strict kind of back and forth reaction. What might these look like? There could be some coatings on a diatom shell. So these are lab made, but you can see that this is a diatom frustral. It's been cleaned. And then when you put it in the right kind of like chemistry and soup, you can generate these pretty quickly. And in terms of their importance, these are very important in different kind of deltaic systems, things like the Amazon, Mississippi River, and then Shirley and Bob have done work kind of globally trying to constrain these rates. So let's think, why do they matter? This is the 2021 view of the marine silicon cycle, and the units are in teramoles of silicon per year, and you can see the burial in the whole of the ocean is on the order of 9. Reverse weathering, which is dominant in these coastal, especially in deltaic systems, is 4.7. This is a really big number. How big is it? Well, it exceeds the burial of all the biogenic silicon in the Southern Ocean and oligotrophic gyres combined. Okay, that's a lot of area. That's a lot of oceanic area. So this is big. And then in terms of what this means locally, in a place like the Mississippi River and the Northern Gulf, this could represent a significant fraction, like 40% or more of the long-term silicon storage in this system. So that's important, yes, but now the question comes to temporal variability, which is really exciting because of how we've been talking about this in the session so far. So how do extreme weather events alter the rate in deltaic sediments? And we were fortunate, or not so fortunate, to go out a couple days before this behemoth, Hurricane Ida. This was a Category 4 hurricane. Okay, this is an exceptionally powerful storm. It did a significant amount of damage. And we went out in August before the hurricane hit, a couple days before, in fact, about a week. And then Shirley led an effort which we called the Extreme Silica Cruises. And we went out in December following the storm, March, June, and August. And now, coincidentally, we were delayed by yet another hurricane last September, and we got out 3 and 10 days to this same station post-hurricane. It was only a Category 2 storm, but so the data we're going to show you is based off a Category 4 storm, and we got out with a rapid NSF award. As you can see, took 4 months to get back out, but we got out. We have data from a couple stations that we occupied multiple times, but I'm only going to focus on this station because we only got 10 minutes and I'm talking pretty fast anyway. So, Station 1. Why is it called Station 1? Because I could get out and back, and we only did 3 stations with the amount of ship time we had. So, what I'm going to tell you about is using silicon stable isotopes as a tracer. And I know this group is fairly diverse, so we want to go into it a little bit. Silicon stable isotopes work just like you would think with carbon stable isotopes or nitrogen stable isotopes, or even with del-18 that Alan was just showing. But we're applying them to the particle pool of silica in these sediments. So this is a method built off what Bob and his group have published. And we basically leverage 2 types of extractions, whether a traditional extraction of how you take silica out of sediments, which was by Dave DeMaster, and then Bob and Panagiotis Michailopoulos, they added this added step to remove kind of metal oxide and autogenic products that might be coating and embedding. Remember that picture of the diatom I showed you earlier. And then you go through this digestion, and usually what we see is we get a lot more material out. So we've applied this in systems, and you can see that the silicon released, this is in the traditional method, and then the same samples paired, we generate a significantly more silicon, which is what everyone sees when they do this. But what's interesting is we also generate isotopically heavier silicon, which means that if you're mixing 2 end members, this represents an intermediate point And so we can calculate what that silicon 30 looks like. And this is really heavy. In fact, it's so heavy, it can only really be diatoms, right? So diatoms from the water column that are sucking down silicon to such a low level that they imprint that heavy silicon into their shells. So this is some work we published with my PhD student, Rebecca Pickering, a couple of years ago. So what we're going to do is we could use pore water, but pore water is tough to get and you can't have that much, but we got plenty of particles. And we're going to look at how this changes over time in response to this hurricane. Okay, so we see this offset at the first start. So this is the one with the leach, these black circles, and the open ones are without the pre-leach. So we see this offset, okay? This is what we expect. But after the hurricane, that goes away. And in fact, it goes away, the place where it's kind of at its minimum is in the highest dissolved silicon in the pore water, which I'll show you in a second. August 2022, a year after the storm, we start to reestablish this. Okay, so the storm has done something. The storm has kind of taken apart this clear difference, which we've seen in many different regions. We've seen this in the Barents Sea, south of Svalbard. We've seen this, my collaborator has seen this in the open ocean as well. We see this offset between these pools with and without this leach in many systems. What happened? Well, the pore water in the dissolved silicon phase was low. After the storm, it got exceptionally high. It about doubled. And then a year after the storm, it had declined. It had been consumed, but it's still not back to the pre-storm condition. And the isotopes in the pore water of silicon are very heavy. They're heavier than the particles themselves, which is also another interesting thing. So following the storm, what we saw is we saw a near doubling of dissolved silicon in the pore waters. So this would suggest a significant amount of particle silica dissolution. Okay, so the storm gets in, shakes up the water, shakes up the sediments. This is about a 45 to 50 meter sediment site, and we get a lot of silica dissolution. We lose authigenic phases. Remember that stuff that's in the acid leach? I didn't show the data because I just didn't have time, but we lost a lot of that in the sediment particles. And then that difference that we saw in the isotopic composition between those two pools, it's gone after the storm. And the storm where they were almost identical was also that depth where we had the maximum silicon in solution. So what this all infers is that we have a really rapid authigenic reactions. And again, the coarseness of our sampling is just because that's how fast we can get boats out, but it's still a couple months, so we can constrain this to pretty fast timescales. All the sample pore water had isotope signatures that were heavier than the particles which these things originally come from, right? So the particles dissolve and processes are basically dissolving and reprecipitating to enrich that pore water in isotopes much higher than beyond just a kind of a mixing line. So some mixing that Shirley had done in a mixing model. And 1 year later, that offset had reestablished in the particles. So the dissolved pool is going really quickly, but the imprint on the particle pool is actually occurring on scales that we can see it, which is pretty exciting. So I kind of said with the reversal of reverse weathering, of course, this was not a true reversal. It was happening. But what we saw is that net effect in the particle pool, which we can interpret as kind of a reverse weathering imprint on the particles, that was eliminated pretty quickly. So that begs the question, how dynamic are these areas? And I think everyone knows they're really dynamic, but how dynamic are the products that are being produced? Are these authigenic coatings that are on the silicons, are these a permanent barrier? Or can these be stripped and reworked, maybe? And what does this mean for interpreting downcore processes in these marine systems? It's tough because in this area, this hypoxic area, people here have inferred biogenic silicon as showing some response to eutrophication, right? And so we've had a lot of land use changes in the catchment of the Mississippi River in the 20th century. There's enrichment of biogenic silica, but we see that extreme events can really kind of knock and change this. How do you interpret a core locally going down? So again, I want to keep to the time, but I do have some acknowledgements, of course, NSF, but collaborators who we ran the stable isotope measurements at for the particles. It was at ETH Zurich, in Greg DeSouza's lab at Minnesota, Xinwang Zhang's lab. We have other collaborators. Kanchen also always gives us supplies, which is pretty exciting. And ultimately, we have a lot more data. In fact, here's some of it, but I can't show that to you because we don't have time. So please ask questions. And I think I have 10 seconds to spare. Yes.